First of all, my name is David Long. I live in Boston, but I spent a couple months down in St. Augustine for the last 10 years. So that's where I met Nancy a couple years ago. So she was kind enough to invite me to speak to you. And I'll talk about landscape photography. I am from New England. I do travel a lot. So it'll be a little bit New England centric in terms of what you see today. But there's a lot of images from around the world and even some from down here in Florida. So hopefully it's entertaining, and we'll talk about, landscape photography and hopefully how to take your landscape photography maybe to the next level. I'll start out by saying if you want to create maybe a pretty photo, but one that's usually boring to judges and boring to your audience, put your tripod up, put a 50mm lens on, and take your shot. Why is that? Because most people are between 5 and 6 feet tall, and the human eye is around a 50mm lens. Not that you've taken a bad photo, it's just the fact that everybody has seen it with their own eyes. So we'll talk a little bit today about how to change that, how to change the perspective, how to change the image so that the audience sees something, but sees it differently than they've seen it before. And how do you do that to make your photo not only technically excellent, but also very interesting? Creating landscape images has multiple components. It's composition, how you arrange your focal points, people, natural objects, buildings in your photo relative to other things in the photo, and how to make them interesting. Finding a perspective that interests your audience, what we started the discussion on, and finding and using available light to optimize the scene in accordance with what your vision is. Use other tools to lead the viewers to your focal point and develop a story or a mood that seduces or engages your audience so that they want to stay with the photo. That's what we'll end with, is the holy grail, is how do you create a story so that the person viewing your photo looks at it again, wants to come back and look at it a third time because they find a story or they find interest in it. Like I said, a lot of these, I'll kind of tell you where these images are. This is in Northern Ireland, a place called the Dark Hedges, which was made famous several years ago by some TV shows, but this is done at about 400mm, compressing the whole row of these particular ash trees.
Oh, I've seen this.
Still getting a little bit larger than the photo is, and it's definitely brighter than the image is, so I apologize. Screens never do justice for what the photo looks like. But what I first talk about landscape photography is finding a focal point. In many cases, what are you photographing? It's almost always essential to have a focal point, photographing something rather than pointing your camera out at the distance. I know all of you travel. I travel in New England a lot, where I'm, constantly barraged up in the White Mountains, and we'll say scenic view, and you go there, and it's absolutely beautiful in terms of the human eye. But you put your camera up to your eye and look, and it's very hard to find anything to take a picture of because there's nothing out there except a bunch of trees and a bunch of sky. So finding a focal point, finding something for your eye to focus on, to me is the critical thing in landscape photography. It's like a stage, when you go to a play and you see a stage, and it's always interesting, but until the actor gets up there and starts to do something and gives you something to put your eyes on, it starts to become interesting once that actor or focal point enters the scene. So effective composition is how you place the different elements in an item, in an image, relative to each other while using light and techniques, to bring the subject into to that focal point. This is in the southern part of Iceland at the Black Sand Beach down there, and an amazing scene, and would be amazing, but by having these two people climb this particular rock and using them as a focal point, and then bracketing and using the tide line and using the various rocks to produce, more of a framing technique and a leading line into that, it creates even a more interesting image than you had just taken it with just the scene itself. This one was taken actually at around midnight when they have the midnight sun. So this was taken very late, and the image doesn't necessarily show it up on the screen, but it's almost dark when this particular image is taken. So I had to wait for these particular two guys that were a little bit crazy, because this beach usually takes out about a dozen people a year with rogue waves in terms of deaths. These guys decided they had to climb up on this particular rock, and then I had to wait for them to get very still because I was shooting at a very long shutter speed. What's an example of a focal point? In this case, there's no doubt this is in Cape Cod, where I live now. One singular decommissioned lighthouse called Stage Harbor Light. One subject dominating the frame produces an interesting image, but trying to engage with, this was taken in January, so the seagrass is all a golden color, and the winding dirt road coming in as a leading line is a way to enhance, as well as creating a really nice backdrop with sunrise right behind the lighthouse. Sometimes simplification is the easiest way. This is a very dynamic scene, obviously really washed out on the projector, but this is a very easy way. In winter, we simplify scenes by shooting in the snow. In many cases, you can do the same thing down here by creating beach scenes or scenes that are dominant on one particular type, whether it's seagrass, whether it's basically trees, something that basically is uniform to the particular scene that you're shooting, but also having one particular focal point that's very opposed to what the rest of the scene looks like. In this case, it's a red barn out in a pretty severe snowstorm that gives you isolation to that particular scene and allows you to create, a very strong image with a singular focal point. But more often, there is more than one focal point in the scene, and it creates in many cases, your job is to kind of take the chaos out of the scene. So make sure your audience can identify the key subject. Key subjects, if something is bright, if there's lettering, or there's an animal or a human being in the scene, almost always the human eye will go to one of those three things. So we have kind of two of the three here. We have a human being, and we have basically a bright light right in the middle that these Chinese fishermen is holding over in the Lee River Valley. We've kind of used the raft as a leading line, and we've got the karst mountains as a background to frame that, and along with the two birds that the Chinese fisherman uses for fishing. He's creating basically almost bracketing posts for your eye to basically keep almost artificially vignetting that through the mountains and through the birds, and using the boat as a leading line to take you to what you probably looked at the beginning, but what creates an opportunity for you to keep coming back to that particular one, because I have the components of the image keep driving you back to the main subject. So when you're positioning, I think probably most people are knowledgeable on the rule of thirds. Is probably the most popular way for photographers to frame landscape images. Actually borrowed from the painters, all throughout, the 15th, 16th, 17th century, would always use the rule of thirds, and it kind of migrated over into photography when we started doing photography in the 1900s. A particularly interesting point is they've actually done groups to survey what part of the 4 parts of the rule of thirds is the most popular. And in this case, the one position is the most popular, where the lighthouse or the windmill is. 4 is the least popular, but diametrically opposed, which is good for balancing purposes, and then 3 and 4. So if you're shooting rule of thirds as your rule, you want to usually use 1 and 4, or you want to use 3 and 2 to create your image, to create balance, and also to create and follow that particular rule. There's also the Fibonacci spiral, which is kind of nature's rule. You see it in shells and other various ways of doing particular accenting of the focal point. And in this case, you can see starting off at the mailbox, donation box here up in Vermont, moving around in a spiral with the roadway, with the overhanging trees, coming back down here, and eventually ending up at what I want you to look at, which is this old farmhouse up in Vermont, Jenny Farm. That's a spiral technique of basically creating a landscape images. So paying attention, first of all, what is your key focal point? What do you want people to look at? And then arranging the components and using some simple rules to basically create an avenue for your audience to see the picture is first and foremost important in landscape photography. But I encourage all my students in workshops to shoot with abandon. What does that mean? When I get to a scene, generally speaking, I find that my eye works much better on the computer at home than it does through the viewfinder. I have enough knowledge to basically go out and figure out good compositions, but what I like the best tends to emerge when I get home and start to look at multiple different opportunities of shooting that scene. So in many cases, I'll be at a landscape opportunity that I particularly like. I like the light, I like the focal point, I like the components of the screen, and I'll shoot 10 to 15 different variations on that particular one. So many of my students put their tripod up, they put a lens on, and they sit there for a half hour and photograph exactly the same scene for a half hour, waiting for the spectacular sunrise or the spectacular light to hit the scene. And I almost have to say, guys, you got that shot. You can always come back to it. So get down low, get up high, change your lenses, change your scene, look around for different perspectives, because half the time you kind of go in with your mind because you've seen the image before and you want to replicate that image. And I tell people that's fine. You're at this lighthouse or you're at this particular scene. Absolutely, get the money shot that you've seen and that you came for, but then try to change it around so that you create more interest in the scene, so that your audience says, I know that place, but I don't know it the way this particular photographer has shown it to me. So in many cases, simple things like moving your focal point. So here at this particular glade down in West Virginia, National State Park down there, Glade Babcock Grist Mill down there, normal rule of thirds would put it here. I liked it up here. Why? I like the bracketing better on the trees. I can see more of this particular tree up in this area. And I like the way the waterfalls, in many cases, are taking the viewer's eye into this particular mill, which is the focal point, where here the waterfalls are taking your eye out of the scene. And so in many cases, my preference was to shoot it, even though I'm violating the rule of thirds by putting it in the center. I liked it here because all the components were working better for me. But that's just moving around, in many cases 5 or 6 feet of moving around to different venues within the same particular shot. Focal point is positioning. How do you create tension in your photograph? Tension meaning it's different than the viewer expects it. So this was a use of what's known, and I'll talk about it in a little bit later, but the use of negative space. So I'm in a big snowstorm up on Cape Cod, and I see this bench here, and in many cases I could have put the bench here, and I could have put the bench over here, but I put the bench down way down here and used this whole area to create negative space. What does the negative space do? It creates more energy, positive energy for your focal point. Doesn't always work, but that's a case of trying different scenes and trying different ways to basically change or break the rules of where you put your focal point. Center focusing, very popular for dynamic single objects. When you put dynamic, in this case, down on the forgotten coast of Florida, down in Apalachicola, I found this particular trip boat that had been docked for a couple of years down on one of the beaches there. This is big. I got close. I'm very wide because I really like the clouds overhead, the very dynamic light that was coming in here. This would have looked odd being on one side or the other side. So you'll see a lot of big subjects, again, lighthouses and churches and architectural images where you only have one single subject. Don't be afraid to put that in the middle of your, to create really dynamic strength of that one particular object right in the middle. So experiment, please your eye. You know, in this case, you know, I was in Holland and shot this particular row of houses, long exposure to get a little bit of reflection. The sky was totally gray, and thus the reflection I was getting was totally gray. I took it to high key and just placed it right in the middle, and it became one of my favorite images from Holland, you know, just because of the fact that I shot it a little bit different and I placed it a little bit different than I would some of my normal images. So first rule, experiment, get to the place that you want, move around. More and more, I'm encouraging my students to get rid of their tripod. So I shoot Canon R5. If you're shooting mirrorless, I can hand hold pretty easily down to 1/8 of a second. Most cases, if I need to, 1/2 of a second. At that point in time, getting rid of the tripod allows me to move up and down, moves different angles. People are, you know, especially our age group, has been born and raised shooting on a tripod because things weren't clear. Nowadays, technology is helping us, and being able to move quickly and move at different levels by hand holding is becoming a lot more apparent. So I really encourage that for students to get off their tripod and try shooting without it. You know, so shoot low. This is a case where if I had to shoot a tripod, I wouldn't have been able to shoot it. I'm lying down on the surf in Cape Cod, shooting this basically from, you know, clamshell level. This wasn't going to be an interesting photograph if I stood at 5 feet and I looked straight down with a 50mm lens. So I had a blank sky, a bluebird sky, you know, the bane of landscape photographers, as I call it. And I said, how can I make this different? I can bring in a reflection, and I can do it by changing the perspective, because in many cases, you know, unless you're a very small person or a snail or a clam, you're not going to get this view. And this is, so change around and do this. Tripod doesn't allow that. I'm literally 1 inch off the ground when I shot this. So perspective is the next clue, you know, in terms of that. We have a lot of cranberry farms where I live up in Cape Cod. You know, traditional shot, telephoto shot, where the guys that are beating the bogs over here. This is collapsed with some of the minimal fall foliage we get on the Cape. But then I climbed, you know, a particular hill that was about 30 feet high to shoot down at the same guys doing the bog, and then using the drone to get up above them to see the patterns that are being created by the cranberry bogs. What's the rule there? Everybody's, you know, everybody's seen the picture of the guys at eye level gathering the cranberries. So how do you make that picture different, you know, on the same particular scene? Lenses is a great way to change your perspective on things. So this is a scene in Boston called the BC Bridge, Boston College Bridge. Very popular shot, city shot in Boston, going down the Charles River. And this is the very popular shot because there's a graffiti-filled railroad bridge that's right in front of the BU Bridge that provides a wonderful foreground subject for the particular shot of the city of Boston. So I shot this, got my shot, 16 millimeters. In many cases, And then I took out the 95 millimeter lens to zoom in a little bit on the full city of Boston, and then zoomed out a little bit here, called in the rowing team from the Harvard Rowing Club right on cue. They came in on time, and at 120 millimeters, I framed just the Hancock building, which doesn't even show in this particular scene, but framed and turned a little bit to my right, got this, and saw a couple rowers. You don't see it on here, but saw a couple rowers out here, and then took out the the longer lens and shot just the single rower. In many cases, with the kind of the silhouetted or the reflection of the Hancock building in the waves created by the rower. What's the lesson from this particular one? 4 interesting images from one location, one scene, shot within 5 minutes of each other. So perspective can be achieved by lenses. I shoot as a landscape photographer. I do almost everything either 40 millimeters and wider or 80 millimeters and longer. So I'm always looking for a scene that I can shoot very wide with a very interesting foreground, or very telephoto so that I can compress the scene, or I can grab individual parts of a particular location that are interesting to me rather than shoot the full scene. A lot of times I'll go up that same vista in New Hampshire, and people will be up there with their cell phones shooting the panorama, and I'm there with a 500 millimeter lens picking out, a little church, or picking out a little waterfall or something in the scene that's beautifully surrounded by, maple trees or something of that nature. Just an individual, what I call, very intimate type of landscape shots rather than vista type shots. Another rule of thumb I always tell people, it's amazing how many people don't want to get close to their subject. So how do you create interest for your viewer? Make them feel like they're in the picture. And how do you do that? Get closer. It's amazing how many people will stand in front of the lupins up in Sugar Hill, New Hampshire, and they'll stand 6 feet away from it. I said, get right in the middle of the lupins, go wide, and if you have to focus stack, this was focus stacked, which I do quite regularly nowadays. So this is 4 images all stacked together to get everything in focus, but I'm 18 inches away from the first lupin. That's 20 millimeters in this case, I believe. And I'm shooting so that I want the audience to feel like they are in the field of lupins rather than looking at the field of lupins. Huh? No, that was tripod. If you're focus stacking, while you can do it handheld with the new cameras now, the R5, for example, I can focus stack because I can auto focus stack in the camera, meaning I set it for focus stacking and it will shoot however many images it needs to. And as long as I hold my camera still, I'm fine. But if you don't have, what I teach people initially is if you're going to focus stack, definitely do, it's a lot easier on a tripod. Obviously, with something like that, you have to worry, the one thing you worry about on something like that is wind. Details, lighthouse in Scituate, Mass. In many cases, very interesting with the keeper's house and full moon rising behind the lighthouse. But for me, the added interest here is all the people lined up watching the full moon rise. So shooting at 250 to 300 millimeters, shooting at about 1.33 miles, which is my go-to for moon rises. I'm able to compress the scene. So in many cases, I make the moon look a little bit on net, a little bit larger, but hopefully not beach ball size like you see on some. And I basically bring all these people over here to balance out the photo and create some interest of them all looking out at the same moonrise that I'm photographing. So, next in kind of line is find good light. Doesn't mean it's always magic hour. It can be storms. It can be all kinds of things, that create interesting light. This is again done in Iceland, and this was again done about 1 o'clock in the morning. Interesting light is, essential for good composition to be effective. So I tend to go with my composition first, and then I'm looking for interesting opportunities for light for that interesting composition. So when I do my scouting, I'm always looking to say, did I find a scene that I really like? And then I kind of make a mental note, and say, under what conditions, under what light do I think this would be good at? And then look and see what the weather looks like, or when I might have to be there to get that particular type of light. So evaluate your scene, what light you think would be good, to create some interest on it, and then hopefully, if the location is close by, go back to it multiple times and try to get that light. This is not. Yeah, this is basically one shot, and it's basically the lava in the foreground, the black church, if you're familiar with that, and then the rising sun that's just kind of dipped under the horizon at about 1:30 in the morning. So what do I mean about keep going back, right? This is a location, if anybody follows me, on Instagram or whatever, I'll post this particular one quite often. This is what we call the Old Stone Church up in Massachusetts. And in many cases, you can see that I go back quite often. And because it was close by where I used to live, I would challenge myself to go back and find different light or a different way to shoot it. Different season, different time, different perspective, different lens. How can I create something that's interesting? So we have fall from this side. We have a summer sunset from this side. We have winter from this side. We have a foggy late fall midday shot. We have a crazy side shot with some crazy clouds. And then, basically a late fall shot over on this side. So if you got a scene that you really like and you capture it once, don't feel like okay, I've got that one. I don't have to go back. Keep going back and keep challenging yourself to find a different perspective and different light to view that particular photo on. Light, as I talked about, light against dark, dark against light. Easy rule. Lower Yosemite Falls right here, bracketed by some beautiful lodgepole pines out in Yosemite. Very easy bracketing, with the trees on the side, and very easy to create the eye to come right down to the waterfall with obviously the gushing waterfall kind of nestled in between the trees. Weather, I've almost now described myself more as not as a landscape photographer, but as a weather photographer. So I am constantly looking for interesting weather. Bad weather is good photos. Horrible weather is great photos. And you know what? You don't have anybody in your way. Nobody else is going to be shooting that scene. You're all by yourself. So when a hurricane comes in, I know it's dangerous. Be safe. I'm not asking you to go out like one of the weathermen and hang from the pole and take the photo. I'm just saying big waves, fog, storms, clouds, wonderful weather takes what is ordinarily mundane subjects and make them interesting. This is a snowstorm with basically a sand fence on Cape Cod. We had 70-mile-an-hour winds and 30 inches of snow. So it happened to be 5 minutes from my house. I drove out. I got out of the passenger side of the car, ducked down so the wind didn't blow me over, took 3 shots, got back in, and drove home. So you don't have to be a polar explorer to get really good landscape photos, but if you know where you're going and you know kind of what you're trying to achieve, and then you wait for those conditions, that's when you're going to create some amazing images. This particular image, again, it doesn't show up well on the screen, won the New England, there's 70 New England clubs, and this was picture of the year. And the judge afterwards said there were 10 entrants in this, and 9 of which I could figure out how to reproduce. I had no idea how to reproduce this particular shot. And so he said, that was the deal breaker. He said, I love the shot, but he also was one where he said, I don't think I could ever get this particular image. You know, clouds, I'm a huge cloud watcher, you know, so interesting clouds. And you live in a place where there are a bevy of interesting clouds. Driving up here tonight, I almost turned around and didn't come to the meeting because there were some really good clouds out there that I wanted to, no, I was just kidding. I always am looking for clouds. So this is, again, an interesting subject. Why? It's dynamic. It's one particular item. So where did I place it? I placed it right in the center. And I waited for the clouds to come and give me kind of that shooting effect. So I, again, took 10 or 15 different particular images down low, 15 millimeters, got right up on the barn, even though it doesn't look like it, and basically had the camera pointing straight up so that I got the barn in the front, but then I got this huge array of clouds going off, you know, in all directions. So in this case, pay attention to clouds, watch clouds. I do a lot of studying of the weather to see what the clouds are going to look like so that I can optimize my scouting locations. Yes? That's a great question. In this case, I used, this is actually a short shutter speed here, even though it looks like it's a long one. So if I'm trying to create that really smooth effect, you know, I'll put a neutral density filter on and I'll shoot a 1 or 2 minute exposure to create that floating effect. But this case, you know, I had enough definition, you know, in the clouds here that I wanted to maintain. So I chose in many cases to shoot the standard shutter speed, which was probably around a 60th of a second. Good question, though. So get out, you know, the rule is get out on stormy days, you know, colors get really saturated in snowstorms and rainstorms. In inclement weather is where you get your best colors and you get your most dramatic landscape. So again, a cool old mill up in New Hampshire that I, you know, drove around the corner, saw this, you know, with the hillside all covered with fog and the snow draping off the trees. And it was a place that I'd never seen before. I immediately pulled over and jumped into the woods and shot this down, you know, down the tributary that used to feed the mill. And it's basically a 300 millimeter shot to collapse the mountainside in the background and the mill together. So person who sees this particular image, who's familiar with this location, looks at it and says, I know that location, but I don't know that image because you've basically got a different place you've shot it from, and you've shot it at 300 millimeters to compress the scene, which the human eye doesn't see that way. You know, fog, if you get fog, just get your camera and go out and shoot. It's just a great opportunity. You know, St. Augustine, I've been there 3 weeks. We have not had one foggy day. I'm still waiting for fog before I leave on Sunday. I'm not sure I'll get it, but we get a lot of it on Cape Cod. So again, very simple image. But by shooting it early morning in the fog with the kind of sun starting to come through, creates a whole different scene than what you'd get if the fog wasn't there, or certainly what you'd get on that particular scene if it was 2 hours later or at sunset. So balance is important to me. I'm a landscape photographer, but in landscape photography, night photography to me is just another avenue to expand your opportunities for landscape photography. Balance is a big thing. You know, so in this case, I'm balancing off the lighthouse here in Cape Cod with the Milky Way up here. So balance is something that I'm not sure it's something you can teach yourself as much as just shooting a lot. You'll kind of understand when photos start to get out of balance. So this is a case where that barn that I showed earlier, this is a case where the image over here, everything is kind of out of balance. Everything is over on the right-hand side, and the left-hand side doesn't really have much balance to it. By moving over 5 feet, I've created a nice balance here. Remember that rule of thirds thing with, something interesting down here and something, so the 2-3 position, I've created a nice balance here. And I was lucky enough that this little opening is here. So I've got, in many cases, a leading line that comes through and then an opening in the fence that allows your eye to visually walk through to the barn. So again, shooting a lot of different images, a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different angles of something that when you got home, I probably, through the viewfinder, didn't think much different about this image than I did here. But when I got home and kind of analyzed it, that one won out over the other one. And for me, it won out because of balance. Yes? I'm shooting all zooms. So I carry the Holy Trinity, as they say, 15-35, 24-105, and 100-500. I have a prime that I shoot 14 millimeters for astro, and I have a macro 100 millimeter that I shoot for the little bit of macro that I do. Changing the angle, this is called a Dutch angle. You'll see it in many cases. The kids use it a lot on Instagram and things to just take everything and put a 20-degree slant on it. Lighthouse up in Marshall Point, Maine. So this dynamic angle, again, creates tension. I was right under the lighthouse so that I didn't get, so I didn't blow out it with the light. This is the lighthouse, one of a few in Maine that doesn't have a rotating cab up top. It just has basically a stationary cab and the lights go out there. So if you shoot a long exposure, 20 seconds like you would for Milky Way photography, you're going to get those black lines going out like a wagon wheel.
Meeting from the photography club again, really very good.
I positioned myself down and shot it at an angle so I could accentuate and grab the Milky Way kind of coming in as a leading line to the lighthouse, and obviously having all the leading lines, but also creating this little bit of tension by shifting it at a 10 or 15 degree angle. Yes. No. What I do a lot to avoid that is I'll shoot what's known as vertical panos. Vertical panos. So in many cases, if I come to a lighthouse and I need a 15 millimeter lens, and I know now the keeper's house and something on this side or the lighthouse or whatever is going to be keystone, what I'll do is take the 15 millimeter and turn it vertical and shoot 5 across. And that keeps everything in line, perfectly in line. And then I stitch it together in Lightroom, and then I carve out the shot out of the pano that I want for the frame. And that will, in many cases, eliminate you can correct some perspective in Lightroom and Photoshop, but in some cases, if you get really wide, it's really difficult. And almost always I'll tell people, don't shoot wide if you've got a structure, trees, buildings, church steeples, lighthouses. You're never going to be able to correct it so that it looks real, like your eye would see it. So turn it over, shoot it across, overlapping 30%, give yourself 30% on each side, and then carve out the picture you want out of that, and you'll eliminate the perspective problem. Yep. So repetition, repetition, another thing in landscape. Not really a landscape shot, but hey, you're in Boston, you got to go to Fenway, right? In many cases, humans love repetition. It creates a feeling of knowing what's coming next, and providing a break in the repetition is a way to create interest, create tension. So this is a famous seat in Fenway that supposedly is the Ted Williams hit the longest home run, and it's way out there. And a lot of people will shoot it from down at the seat itself. I was up in the bleachers shooting it with a telephoto to kind of create this repetition effect. But use repetition. You'll see it a lot in nature. Embrace that repetition and use it to create interest in your photos. You know, this is rule of odds. You know, again, we're getting into minutia now on landscape photography, but important things. The eye likes 1, 3, and 5. Doesn't like 2 and 4. And it's all back to that balance situation. If you've got 1 in the middle, you've got 3, 1 in the middle, you got 5, 1 in the middle, you got 2, where the hell do I place it? And the eye just starts to look at it and says, I don't like 2. I don't like 4. After 5, it doesn't matter. So in many cases, if you can, a lot of times there's not 3 boats, there's only 2, or whatever, there's only 2 lighthouses, or whatever the rule is. In this case, you know, I had a whole line of in Valençon, France, with the lavender going up to it. You know, I was able to choose 3 rather than choose 4 to make that, again, more palatable to the viewer's eye than if I'd used 4 or 2. Depth, more and more, the more depth you have in a photograph, the more interesting normally the photograph is. So try to find interesting foreground subjects, and in many cases, try to find interesting background subjects. So this is in Rhode Island, down in Newport. So we've got a foreground, we've got the boat, we've got the midground with Rose Island Lighthouse here. We've got the Newport Bay Bridge in the background. We've got this, and we've got the sky. So depending on how you look at it, I'm looking at 5 or 6 levels of depth in this particular image, which is a lot more interesting image than if I just focused on the lighthouse and the bridge. But by creating the boat in the front and creating the reflection of the boat in front, I create, again, layers of depth in the photograph. Yes, in the back? Focus, and when you're creating depth, not necessarily always the case, but almost always the case. If your first item that the viewer is going to see is out of focus, you're dead. You can get progressively softer as the image goes backwards, but if the bridge is, as you can see, the lighthouse is softer in focus, the bridge even softer in focus, but that sailboat better be sharp or it's a done deal. In this case, I was shooting at probably not that long. So I probably used f11 because I wasn't that far away. I was probably shooting this at about 85 millimeters, something like that. If I was, there's some other places I can shoot Newport and Rose Island from to get the boats from that it requires 300 millimeters. In that case, I'd probably be shooting at f13 to f18. Again, just making sure that I got that boat in focus and then as much focus as I can get on the background subjects. You know, so what we talked about, this foreground subject here, always going to be in focus. This is going to be softer. This is going to be, it's okay, depending on your weather conditions, it's okay whether that's very soft or even out of focus. You know, so an example would be this particular shot. You know, again, when you get into fog, you get into a situation where I want these railroad tracks to be very much in focus. My subject is soft, and the background, I want to create an infinity effect. There's no end to this particular train track or wherever it's going. So I want to soften that out as much as possible. So I don't really care whether that's in focus at all. There was a question in the back. Yeah, this should be in focus. If you saw the image that No, I didn't say that. I didn't say the focal point always had to be in sharp focus. It has to be an acceptable focus. So if these tracks were totally out of focus, it wouldn't matter what my subject was. So if the subject is in sharp focus, good. But it doesn't necessarily have to be in sharp focus. It can be in relatively sharp focus as long as my tracks are in focus. So the difference between a focal point and the focal point being in focus isn't necessarily, it really depends on how much foreground you're putting in and how much you're able to put focus in. So we'll go back to that Lupin shot with the church that we showed earlier. That's easy to do because of the fact that nothing's moving and I can focus stack that and get everything in perfect focus on that. On this particular one, there was no way I could get everything in focus on this particular one. So I have to accept a little bit of soft focus on the focal point, which is the person walking up the tracks. I don't know if that answers your question or not. But yes. If the foreground is important. All right. In this case, railroad tracks are very important in this particular scene because it's the leading line. If he was just walking in a field, I might have the foreground out of focus and the subject in focus, and creating that kind of bracketing effect of focus behind and before. You'll see a lot of that in flower photography. You'll see the foreground all bokeh out, with a lot of soft focus on the opening petals, and then you go to something right in the middle and it's sharp focus, and then you go in the background and you got the bokeh. And so it really depends on the subject and but in this case, if this was totally out of focus, the viewer would look at that and say, that's not appealing. Good questions though. Visual flow, I'm a big proponent of leading lines. So as you can see, I use this leading line. This is a good rule of thumb if you do surf photography down here in Jacksonville. So the wave recedes at half the speed it comes in. So I'll measure, in many cases, the length of time it takes a wave to come in over the shore. So let's say it comes in 4 seconds. I know for the most part, it's going to recede in 2 seconds. So what I want to do is get this, what I call curtain effect here, unless I'm trying to get little waterfalls coming over the rock or something like that. I'm almost always shooting my waves receding because they create this really soft curtain-like effect. In this case, I was working with black sand, so it was even more interesting. And as a result, I've got this crested, with a 3-second exposure. So it crested here and then moved back to create this nice curtain, but it also left me this beautiful leading line that took me into the interesting landscape photography shot. Yes. Yep. Generally, rule of thumb is that it recedes at twice the speed it comes in at. So I'm sorry, I misspoke that one. So if it comes in at 2 seconds, it'll go out at 4 seconds. It goes out slower than it comes in, and gives you a really nice cascading effect where when it rushes in, it's not as pleasing to the eye as when it recedes. And a lot of times, the flatter the beach, the more the receding wave creates a curtain type of effect. So a lot of times in St. Augustine, I'll go down and shoot the pier in the morning for sunrise. And I'm looking at the waves coming in. I was doing it the other day when we had a beautiful sunrise on Monday. I was waiting for the waves to go out because it was low tide and it was a really flat beach down at low tide. And I was waiting for those waves to come in. And then as they started to recede, and it doesn't always have to be, that particular rule of thumb, but be aware that there is that rule of thumb. And then if you want to use filters to elongate your shutter speed to create that kind of curtaining effect, that's kind of a rule of thumb that you would use. But the whole point of this one is use those lines to create interesting foreground subjects or to create leading lines into your main subject. So I use leading lines a lot. Lavender fields in Valensole, very easy to see the leading lines, but also lining up in many cases, the area between the lavender is just as important as the lavender fields, the lavender rows themselves, because the brown kind of matches the brown of the stone barn that's out in the field. That's down in Provence. It's an area called Valensole, which is where the main lavender fields are in the south of France. A lot of times visual flow can't be seen with the human eye. It can only be seen by stretching time. So in this case, this is a very long exposure, probably a 5-6 second exposure in Iceland at Brewerfoss. And in many cases, all these lines coming down and this flow of water coming down wasn't visible to my eye, but because I know with a long exposure, I look at flow. I do this with leaf photography and streams in New England and other opportunities where I've got flowing water and there's something in the flowing water that can create a pattern that can create interest. So in this case, it creates a nice little S curve going up into the main body of the falls. And yes, that water is blue like that, and it's off of the glaciers in Iceland. So again, finding normal subjects, this little dory, tides coming in, got these sand ridges on what's known as the Brewster Flats on the Cape, and going down. I won't try to tell you this was planned. I just happened to be down there to shoot sunrise, and tide was coming in, filling all these particular little troughs of sand that are created by the tide going out, and filled this all to create a nice reflection down here. But it also accentuated my leading lines, bringing me down into this little dory. Framing is key. Basically, the community church up in Stowe, Vermont. You can shoot it again with a very attractive foreground and with the mountainside in the back. And in this case, I chose to use this particular tree to create some type of a framing effect on this particular church. And also to kind of create the framing effect over the top, because I had kind of a blank sky that I was working with. So what's your subject? What are some interesting foreground and background things? Nice foreground, nice background, blah, sky. So find something that basically allows you to take that out by kind of framing over the top. Obviously, you get opportunities sometimes where framing just jumps out and screams at you. So this is a ghost town down in Telluride where I went inside, one of the old ramshackle buildings there, looked out the window, and there was this mountain, out in the background. So this is basically a frame within a frame. So if you get opportunities like this, you'll get them through windows, you'll get them through other opportunities, take advantage of them. They, again, create interest on the main focal subject, which is this, but also this becomes very interesting as a secondary place to look. Yes, in the back. No, I actually, this was basically a bracketed shot. So I shot, and maybe that was your question. So I shot one shot for the interior, one shot for the window, and put them together. Because obviously I was going to blow out the window if I exposed for the inside and vice versa. Huh? Yep, a bracketed effect. Yep, exactly. But, the key is with bracketing is my eye saw this. Your eye has about 25 levels of dynamic range from dark to light. The best cameras have about 14. So when I walked in this building, I could see all the inside of this building and I could see that mountain, but my camera couldn't see it. So what I tried to do is replicate what my eye saw because the eye has about 10 or 11 more levels of dynamic range than your camera. Yes. That was tripod. Yep, exactly. Tripod and try not to fall through the floor. Yes. No, I didn't have to because I was reasonably wide. And so when I'm wide like that, I was probably at 30 millimeters, something like that, to get really close. You know, at f11, everything at 30 millimeters, everything is going to be in focus. So I didn't have to change the focus point on that particular one because the wider you get, the more your depth of field increases relative to your focal length. Right on the wood, right on the window, the wood around the window. Framing, you can frame with vignetting. I strongly encourage a little vignetting. I see a lot of over vignetting in landscape photography, so don't get carried away with it, but it's a nice way to bring your eye in. Here, you know, most of you are probably familiar with Magnolia Avenue down in St. Augustine. So here is beautiful live oak trees with the Spanish moss hanging down, and the fog created a natural vignetting for me to go along with the artificial vignetting that I could do with the camera or in post-processing. More and more, it seems like I'm adding people to my photographs. So these are what's known as the clam trees. I won't go into the reason why they're named that, but they're directional markers down on Cape Cod for the boats coming into the harbor, and at low tide, it's a perfectly flat beach. And by adding a human, I've hopefully shown you what the scale is of these particular directional markers. Taking a lot of pictures of this without that, and everybody doesn't know whether they're 30 feet tall or 2 feet tall. So adding a person in here, in many cases, provided scale, and in many cases, because it's silhouetted, hopefully created some interest. The closer the subject is to you, the more the subject is the basis of your photograph. The farther the subject is away, the more the landscape is the subject. All right? So in this case, I wanted to make this particular photo of my son down in Cape Town more about my son. So I got closer to him and shot it, in many cases, with him up front, with the view off of Lion's Head, you know, being secondary. If I had moved back and made him much smaller in the scene, like I did on the Cape of Good Hope, that's not my son, and I don't have any idea how these guys got down here to fish, and I don't know if they've ever been able to get off of here, you know. But in many cases, this is a famous rock down at the point of Cape of Good Hope down South Africa. And in many cases, you know, I shot this with them very, very small. Why? Because I was much more interested in showing the grandeur and the size of this particular rock, with them being small, to create a focal point for you to kind of view in. And by adding these people in, or by having them there, you now kind of have an idea of how big this monolith is, where if they weren't there, you wouldn't necessarily have anything to acknowledge how big that particular piece of stone is. So scale, in many cases, same exact shot at 300 millimeters and shot at 24 millimeters. Standing in exactly the same spot. So what does scale do to you? What's the most important thing in this? The barn, right? Do you see the barn here? Yes, you do, but is it dominating the scene? No, the lavender dominates the scene, and this is an interesting place for your eye to go to, where here, no doubt that I want you to focus on the barn. So again, using different lenses from exactly the same spot created two entirely different photographs. The I love symmetry. This is Amsterdam. I love symmetry, but it doesn't want it to be a mirror image in most cases. It likes symmetry, comfort factor there, but it likes a little bit of difference so that the eye can kind of be quizzed to say, okay, I know that looks the same, but what's different on one side versus the other? So this is one of the canals in Amsterdam, sunset on one of the canals. House, boat, car. This coming right down the middle with sunset coming down the middle. So I've obviously created a symmetrical type of photograph, but hopefully had enough difference between both sides where I've created interest for the viewer. So work with symmetry. Sometimes it does call for perfect symmetry. So this is that old stone church that I was telling you about. Shot it 1,000,000 times, and one time I went out, in October. Sky was perfect, no wind, colors on the tree were perfect. By going back to the same location, I found, my favorite fall photograph of this particular place, and decided because it was so pretty, that I would double up by creating perfect symmetry on both sides of the photograph. Kind of moving toward the end here, I'm a big bugaboo about edges. So a lot of times, this is a dotted line that I put in here, obviously. But a lot of times, if you're not paying attention to edges, you'll get broken grass. You'll get half of a subject, half of a particular building or something like that. I'm a big proponent, of clean edges. This is in Iceland, Vesterhorn in Iceland. Breaking this particular rule, what I tell people is, if you're gonna crop aggressively. Make sure your audience knows it was your design to crop that image. If you crop minutely and there's just the edge of something hanging off, the edge of grass, the edge of something like that, they think you made a mistake. But if you go in and crop right in the middle of a building, or right in the middle of something that's important, but you do it aggressively but attractively, they'll know it was your desire to crop to basically bring them into whatever the focal point is. I give a lot of breathing room to my photograph. This is just a quick one to show you that exactly the same photograph here. I like to give breathing room on both edges rather than, this makes you uncomfortable. It's like walking into a crowded room full of people. You don't have any room to move. So you want to give certain of your focal points room to breathe, some room to expand if it needs to be, so it doesn't feel like it's crowded into the particular frame. Where does the eye go on this page? Right there, So the use of negative space, we talked about it earlier. Just a quick tutorial, creating all this space around this during this snowstorm, creating, this just average looking tree made it a lot more interesting because of all the conditions that I was shooting in, but also because of use of negative space around here to create tension, to bring your eye into this particular area. Doesn't always necessarily have to be severe, so this is a case where, I again used a lot of negative space because I had some really nice clouds with some really nice lines that were bringing your eye, into this particular life-saving house up in P-Town. That, again, hopefully the negative space kind of draws you in with the clouds to create leading lines. So a lot of times shooting it really wide creates an interesting image. I'll go through these very quickly. Sometimes it's a good opportunity to fill the frame. This was a simple sunflower row that I got up on a hill and shot at 400 millimeters. And this is 35 photographs, all focus stacked, all focused, all blended together to give you the perspective that I'm shooting in this massive field when I was shooting in one simple row of sunflowers from up on top of the hill at 400 millimeter type lens. So again, why are we showing this? It's just taking an average scene, changing where I shot it from and what lens I shot it with to create more interest than it would have had if I was standing right in front of it shooting with a 50mm lens. Small things, have your buildings, if possible, have them facing into the frame rather than out of the frame. So here, your eye kind of moves into the center. We're here by placing it on the left-hand side. You're going to read this first, and your eye tends to get pushed out of the frame. And story. You know, this is the secret sauce. I don't have any great rules of thumb on how to use this, but try to create interest in your images. You know, so a couple of ones, you know, create questions. You know, who lives here? Why are these things out? You know, shock. Really? Is there somebody really still fishing like this? You know, how does he even stand on the boat? How, you know, what are these birds doing in the scene? So creates questions. The image hopefully is interesting that you want to look at it, but the story is there to keep you coming back to the image. Mystery. You know, what is this shack doing out in the woods? Who lives here? Why is it abandoned? You know, those type of things that hopefully create a story that goes along with a good landscape image. Human effort. You know, what's going on here? Why is this, you know, where's this going? How far is he going? Is this dangerous? You know, guy pushing off through paddleboarding, you know, in the fog on Cape Cod. So with that, I do run workshops. Most of them are in New England. I run one down here in St. Augustine. I do have cards up here if you want to grab a card and you're interested. I run about 10 or 12 workshops every year, most of them, you know, up in New England. And I have a whole bunch of ebooks. So if you're going up to New England, I have an ebook for most every part of New England that you're going to help you plan your route. And that website that's on here also has a bunch of blogs on how to shoot all, you know, 10 or 15 different blogs on how to shoot different landscape type of products. And with that, we're done. Any last questions? I know we're kind of at a time crunch here at 7:45 to get out, but any other question? I know you guys were very active with some great questions during the presentation. Anything else that I haven't covered? Yes. Do I what? Normally speaking, I have workshops and people sign up for them. But in some cases I have, for camera clubs, have contacted me and wanted a particular, we want to go here. Could you put together a workshop for us there? And I have done that locally, and I have taken a group to Iceland, and I've done kind of everything in between. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you. Hey, you've been a great group. I appreciate all the questions and like I said, I've got cards up here if you'd like to grab one.
Thank you for a wonderful evening.
Thank you,
David. Oh, you're welcome.
Glad you came.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. That'd be fun. Yeah. Yeah.